Thank you. And good afternoon and welcome everyone to USIP. My name is Jennifer Statz and I'm the director of the China program here. And our China program at USIP is focused on China's impact on conflict dynamics in fragile states around the world. Now, as everyone knows, China's overseas investments, and particularly its Belt and Road Initiative, are a key part of this story. In fact, almost every conversation about China these days involves some reference to the Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI. But for those who aren't following it closely, the Belt and Road Initiative, which was announced by President Xi himself in 2013, is a massive project promoting connectivity across Eurasia and around the world. The primary arteries of this effort are the Silk Road Economic Belt and the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road. But the initiative is now open to all countries, as well as all international or regional organizations in all parts of the globe. No one is quite clear how much the project will ultimately cost, but estimates range in trillions of dollars. Now, the initiative is based on bilateral agreements between participating countries and China. And China's plan calls for projects across a number of areas, including infrastructure and facilities connectivity, which tends to get the most attention when we talk about BRI, but it also includes other kinds of projects, things related to policy connectivity, to trade and financial integration, and people-to-people bonds. Now, officials in Beijing have repeatedly stressed that the Belt and Road is intended to be win-win and is intended to promote the Silk Road spirit of peace and cooperation, openness and inclusiveness, mutual learning, and mutual benefit for all involved. Indeed, at his opening remarks at the Belt and Road Summit last month, President Xi said the BRI is a project of the century that will benefit the people of the world. Now, there's clearly enormous potential involved in this project, so today we're going to ask, how is it going? We have a terrific set of experts here this afternoon to help us look a little more closely at some of China's overseas investments and connectivity projects, and to get a better sense of the impact that these projects are having on the ground. The countries we're focusing on today, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and Pakistan, are significant partners in the Belt and Road Initiative and are host to several significant infrastructure projects. And by looking at these three experiences in greater detail, we're hoping to build a better understanding of what the Belt and Road what impact the Belt and Road might have in the short term as well as the long term, how it might evolve in each of these countries, how each country has responded to the projects on the ground, and how these experiences might inform China's approach to future projects. So on our panel today, we will start with Priscilla Clapp, a senior advisor here at USIP and the former chief of mission at the U.S. Embassy in Burma. Nilanthi Samaranayaka, who's a strategic studies analyst at CNA, who will talk about Sri Lanka's experience. Wang Lin, who is here as a research fellow with the CBN Research Institute and a journalist with the China Business News and a visiting fellow with the East-West Center here in Washington, who will talk about the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. And finally, Moeed Yusuf, who is Associate Vice President of the Asia Center here at USIP, to share some additional views on CPEC and Chinese investment in South Asia. So we're going to start, we're trying something new today. We're going to start actually with two lightning rounds from our panelists. So first I'm going to ask each panelist to share their prepared remarks outlining Chinese investment in each of these different countries and the impact that it's had. But I don't want to discuss these projects in isolation. So after they go through and do their opening statements about each country's experience, we're then going to go back through and have them, give them a chance to say a few more words, responding to what they heard from the other panelists, but also highlighting some of the similarities or differences that they might have noticed across countries and across projects. So we are going to try to do both of those relatively efficiently so that we still have plenty of time at the end for questions from the audience. So thank you again for joining us today, and we are going to start with Priscilla Clapp. Thank you.
Okay, I guess it's on, isn't it?
Yep.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here. Jennifer, thank you for the introduction. I'm Priscilla Clapp, and I am at USIP, a senior advisor in the Myanmar program. And I'm going to address the Chinese BRI strategy in Myanmar. In its latest form as a Chinese national strategy, articulated by President Xi Jinping, BRI in Myanmar is still largely in the proposal stage. As such, it has not yet produced discernible economic benefit to Myanmar. While there is no evidence that serious cost-benefit analysis has been performed on any of the major BRI-related projects currently under consideration there, it is nonetheless clear that they would entail multi-billions in debt, initially to Chinese government banks and ultimately to Myanmar. Therefore, the economics of BRI in Myanmar is no trivial matter. Even more consequential, however, is the socio-political impact that large BRI projects are likely to incur in Myanmar and whether this could avoid igniting new areas of conflict. There's already extensive conflict in the country. I'll focus my remarks on a brief outline of China's pre-BRI investment strategy in Myanmar to the extent that it may have served as a kind of laboratory for the development of today's BRI strategy. And I will discuss the formidable political obstacles that must be resolved before it can become a reality in Myanmar. Myanmar's role in President Xi's current BRI strategy already has a history of more than 25 years. In fact, one might easily conclude that in the case of Myanmar, BRI now serves effectively as a Beijing-designed chapeau for a strategy that originated in Yunnan in the 1990s. At that time, Yunnan was starved for resources, energy, and trade routes. So its government and business leaders, including the Kunming branches of the large Chinese state-owned enterprises, conceived of Myanmar as the province's best route to the Indian Ocean that would give it an independent trading connection with the world. They also saw Myanmar as a potential source for energy and manufacturing resources to make the province competitive with China's wealthier manufacturing centers. The major BRI precursor proposals emanating from Yunnan during the 1990s and the first decade of the 2000s included, and I will list them sequentially. One, a dual pipeline to transport natural gas and petroleum from the Bay of Bengal to Kunming. This project was completed more than 5 years ago, but has only recently become fully operational with the construction of an oil refinery in Kunming. Two, investment in offshore natural gas deposits in the Bay of Bengal to produce gas for transport through the pipeline. Enlarging the port at Chaukpu in Rakhine State on the Bay of Bengal to accommodate large ships carrying petroleum from the Middle East to offload into the pipeline to Kunming. The ships have just begun offloading the first petroleum into the pipeline with the completion of that oil refinery. Four, dredging the Irrawaddy River to accommodate larger vessels and building a road from Yunnan to the port of Bamo on the river to complete this as a trade route to the sea. Myanmar's military leaders were never keen on this proposal and seem to have successfully turned it off over the years. Five, building a major highway and high-speed rail line along the route of the dual pipeline. This idea apparently reached the stage of an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, but this MOU was allowed to expire under the Thein Sein government. Six, building a massive hydropower dam at Myitson, the headwaters of the Irrawaddy River in Kachin State. Upon completion, the hydropower plant would have produced 6,000 megawatts of electricity annually, more than 90% of which would have been transmitted to Yunnan. The $3.6 billion dam, however, was fraught with serious social, political, economic, and environmental consequences for Myanmar that had not been taken into consideration by its developers. Thus, during its early stages of construction in 2011, it was suspended by the newly elected president, Thein Sein, in response to popular opposition. Now, the current status of BRI-related proposals is this. During the final months of the Thein Sein government in late 2015 and early 2016, a substantial number of new agreements were signed with Chinese entities for a variety of investments. The incoming NLD government reportedly suspended all of these proposals pending a reassessment of the economic feasibility of the proposed infrastructure and resource extraction projects and whether the terms of the agreements would benefit the Myanmar people and not just the enterprises involved. In response to Chinese requests for a decision on the suspended Myitsone Dam project, the NLD government also undertook to perform a thorough review of the project and present a report by the end of 2016. No report has been released to the public so far, but I think it does exist. Of the other pending projects, the two most relevant to BRI appear to be the Chaukpu Special Economic Zone and port in the Rakhine State on the Bay of Bengal, and a massive 7,000-megawatt hydropower dam on the Than Lin River, which is also called Salween, in Shan State, that reportedly would create a lake large enough to cut the state in half. Press reports on recent meetings between senior Myanmar and Chinese officials have suggested that both sides have been discussing some sort of trade-off between Myitsone and Chaukpu. Myitsone is no longer a compelling interest in Yunnan because they have already achieved energy sufficiency without it. Chaukpu, on the other hand, has taken on significant strategic value to China, so a trade-off would be a logical solution, but I don't think it's going to be easy for them to arrive at the right terms, so it could be still a ways off. Considering that all BRI-related projects would require free access to Myanmar from Yunnan, the most obvious problem facing BRI in Myanmar is the current political instability and historically high level of conflict in northeast Myanmar along the China border, for which there is no end in sight. This area is not even under consideration in the national peace process at this point. In fact, the non-governmental armed entities in this area constitute the bulk of the internal opposition armed forces, and they have formed an alliance adamantly opposed to the nationwide ceasefire agreement, the terms of the peace process, and significant provisions in the national constitution. Efforts by representatives of both the Myanmar and Chinese governments have failed to bridge the wide gap between the demands of these groups and those of Myanmar's military leadership. I mean leadership of the military, not of Myanmar. A second serious obstacle to large Chinese infrastructure and resource extraction projects in Myanmar is the level of public animosity they have created in the past, as exemplified by the successful opposition to Myitsone and the Lepidong copper mine. I haven't discussed that, but we can get into it later. Environmental and other civil society organizations have become powerful forces during the years of transition, and they continue to receive substantial external support. Chinese government and business representatives have not been particularly successful in appealing to or interacting with Myanmar's civil society and labor organizations. And finally, to the extent that the BRI strategy has been captured by the large Chinese state-owned enterprises, these large BRI projects will probably be deliberately over-financed, as in the case of Chaukpu, drawing strong hesitation and opposition in Naypyidaw, Myanmar's capital, now that military and their cronies are no longer the driving force behind these deals as they were in the past. The terms of the Chaukpu Agreement, for example, signed in haste by the outgoing Thein Sein government, raised alarms, serious alarms, with the incoming NLD economic managers. And I think this is one of the issues that's under heavy negotiation right now with China. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Priscilla. Go ahead. Okay.
All right. Well, my thanks to Jennifer Chang and USIP for the invitation to be here. To address the topic today, I thought it might be useful to present a few framing questions to help us understand Sri Lanka as it relates to China and the Belt and Road Initiative. So the first question that I would propose is, what does Sri Lanka want out of all of this? It's been a difficult time for Sri Lanka over the past few years. The country has taken a lot of heat due to the fact that it is engaged in so many projects with China and has gone into a lot of debt as a result of these projects, and has also withstood a lot of criticism and accusations that Sri Lanka is ganging up with China against India, which is a very important country just to Sri Lanka in terms of its economics, politics, security. So what does Sri Lanka want? I think one answer is that Sri Lanka sees itself as a future Singapore, or taking its place along Singapore and Dubai as a major connector of economies and as a site for transshipment of cargoes. So really connecting Singapore and Dubai in the central Indian Ocean. It's strategically located. And I think as a result of that self-identity and that ambition, the country wants to grow, it wants to develop, build critical infrastructure. And I think an additional factor compounding that national ambition is this feeling that the country is starting at a starting line that's further back than it should be. And that is owing to Colombo's war against the LTTE, which it fought for many decades. And that war ended in 2009. So I think these Chinese projects in Sri Lanka, they represent a convergence of a few factors. So first, you have Sri Lanka's desire to build, to grow, especially after the war. It's positioning itself as a maritime hub. It has definitely made that prominent in terms of its communications. And there's this additional feeling that they need to make up for lost time. Then second, I think you have at the same time this push where China was pushing out its construction capabilities and its financing capabilities. There was a surplus domestically, these state-owned enterprises doing these kinds of projects, and also the fact that China will lend money with no strings attached, or relatively few strings attached. And that's attractive to a lot of governments. But this leads me to my third point, is that the international environment grew increasingly hostile to the Rajapaksa government for the way that regime conducted the final phase of the war, for insufficient post-war accountability, and for his authoritarian leadership in the years after the war. You had the UN Human Rights Council issuing resolutions that were very critical of Sri Lanka. So I think it's really the result of a few of these factors, and we have many projects between China and Sri Lanka. Some of them are highways, like the Southern Expressway, which connects Colombo to points down south. Also port projects, the terminal in Colombo Port, as well as the Hambantota Port in the south. Also the airport in Hambantota, even a dam project. Just as an example, in 2016, Sri Lanka obtained $1.3 billion in terms of loans from a variety of sources, and 34% of those were from China, whereas 26% were from the Asian Development Bank. So I think it shows that even despite all of the criticism and the debt, that China still remains a major development partner to Sri Lanka as recently as last year, but that Sri Lanka is also open to other sources of access to doing some of these projects with these loans from like the ADB. So the second question is, how do Chinese activities affect Sri Lanka? What have been some of the impacts? And I think these activities are often framed as being negative. So it's important to take a look at both the benefits and the drawbacks, especially the benefits so you can get into the minds of policymakers in Colombo. I think with the Chinese port investments, particularly in Colombo Port with the terminal there, I think that's helped to facilitate trade, not just with Sri Lanka's trade with the rest of the world, but also India's trade with other parts of the world, because Sri Lanka is really a major site of transshipment. Just in Colombo, the figure that's often cited is roughly 70% of transshipments in Colombo Port go to and from India. Even in Hambantota Port, which has been very criticized as being a port to nowhere, a white elephant project, even that port actually does see transshipment activity of automobiles. So you'll have automobiles that are manufactured in southern India that are transshipped there for destinations in East Africa or the Middle East. You'll have liners as far out as Japan coming through and transshipping automobiles there. So it's really these activities serve this larger goal of increased connectivity. And it's a phrase that's used in South Asia a lot, I think probably because the region is one of the least integrated regions in the world. But it's definitely an ambition to access these global lines of communication. But there are clear drawbacks to these projects, namely the loans that Sri Lanka has had to take out to fund these projects. Clearly, Sri Lanka's debt financing model of development under the Rajapaksa administration, it was not a sustainable model. I think the leadership at the time, they felt certain pressures of having to deliver to the population. Now that the war was over, now they have to deliver on economic growth. So that might have been a factor as well. There's been a lot of estimates about how much in debt Sri Lanka is, but I think the consensus is a considerable portion of the government revenue goes towards servicing these loans. Another drawback is from a development perspective. Some of these Chinese projects are criticized as being poorly done, like the power plant in Narochalai. It's more than $1 billion project, but never quite grabbed the headlines like some of the port projects did, but it's been beset with technical difficulties for the last decade. And experts have also detailed problems with the Hambantota region projects from a planning perspective. Also, there's been local resistance to some of these projects by citizens, such as fishermen and environmental groups that are concerned about some of the environmental impacts, especially along the coastline with the Colombo Port City project. That's been one where people have been very concerned about some of the environmental impacts. And we saw very prominently in December and January protests in the southern part of the country, in Hambantota, in that region, by port workers who were very concerned about the security of their jobs. Also, when news was coming out that the agreement with China would be negotiated where China would get a considerable part of equity in the port in exchange for swapping some of the debt just to address Sri Lanka's balance of payments crisis. We saw major protests there, detaining 2 ships even at the port. And also there was a big concern that China would get a lease to a large swath of land for a special economic zone. At present, the port deal is still being negotiated. I'm not totally optimistic about how it will play out in terms of Sri Lanka's favor in terms of that equity, but I think at a minimum the protests actually worked to some extent because it was supposed to be a done deal by January timeframe, and it's June now and still being renegotiated. And just quickly, the third question is, what are the implications for the international community? And I think for better or worse, China is filling this desire by countries that are yearning for development and infrastructure and just wanting to connect more to the world economy. So it isn't just Sri Lanka, but what's the international community going to do? I mean, if they don't like all of these Chinese projects, I know Sri Lanka, for its part, makes it clear that it's open to a lot of different lenders, certainly not only China. And there's some evidence that India is working to enlist Japan as a major development partner and maybe trying to provide compelling, attractive investment alternatives and projects, such as in the Port of Colombo with the terminal that's being discussed there, and also an LNG terminal in Colombo. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here, and I will mainly focus on about China's investment, the impact of China's investment in Pakistan, especially the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor implemented in the April of 2015. And the first impact is that CPEC, the implementation of CPEC and also the related Chinese investment really reshaped the Pakistan economic prospect in the next 3 to 5 years, and also strengthen Pakistan's economic growth since 2015. And based on the IMF's data, we can find two times. The latest time is about IMF's Article 4 consultation of Pakistan, and in the conclusion report, they evaluated that Pakistan's outlook for economic growth is favorable, and with real GDP estimated at 5.3% in the financial year 2016 to 2017. And it is expected, it is also prospected that it will strengthen to 6% over the medium medium term, and especially on the back of stepped-up CPEC investment. This is the latest estimation, and if we fund the previous one, it was in October 2015. It's almost only 6 months after China has implemented the CPEC in Pakistan, and at that time, with IMF's report, it was from the 8th review and the EFF for Pakistan. They mentioned about 2 driving forces for the further Pakistan economic growth, and one is the planned improvement in the supply of gas and electricity in Pakistan, and we know that the lack of electricity has a long time been one of the most serious bottlenecks of Pakistan's economy, and they expect the expected improvement of the electricity is one of the driving force, and the second driving force of Pakistan's economic growth at that time in October 2015 is the investment related to the CPEC. When evaluating one country's economic growth, I'm related to China's investment of CPEC as one of the 2 or one of the 3 pillars of one country's economic growth. So we can see how Chinese investment, especially under the CPEC, has influenced Pakistan's economic growth and also the prospect. And we think that this trend will also continue in the next 3 to 5 years. And second, the impact is that with the Chinese investment, especially the implementation of CPEC, one of the 4 major areas of CPEC is about the industrial park. And with regard of this, we can see that with Chinese investment, China is sharing with Pakistan China's own economic development experience and expertise in the last 3 decades. And we know that actually in the past 3 decades, China is really a big fan of the industrial park and also free trade zone, and especially recently in the last 3 years, there is a new wave of upgraded free trade zone in different cities in China, in Shanghai, Wuhan, Shenzhen, Shekou, and there are many different cities. And we also know that under the mechanism of CPEC, Pakistan has established we can say that dozens of free trade zone or industrial park. But there are not only with Chinese engagement. We know that with Chinese engagement under CPEC in terms of the industrial park, there is one in Lahore called the Hair Ruba Industrial Park, but that was built before the initiative of the Belt and Road Initiative and also the CPEC. And the other free zone is in Gwadar port. It's called Gwadar Free Zone, and it will also complement with the free trade and also industrialization, manufacturing, and other things. This is one type of the free trade zones in Pakistan, but with China's engagement. But in the past 3 years, there are also other free trade zones in Pakistan that was proposed by other players. One kind is by the Pakistan federal government or by the provincial government. They are also supporting their local free trade zones. For example, like both Sindh province and Punjab provinces. Punjab province have mapped up their guidelines or regulation framework for the free trade zone in their own country, but either with Chinese investment or without Chinese investment. And the third type of free trade zone is that with the international engagement, both World Bank is also piloting a few free trade zones or industrial park in Pakistan, either in Punjab and in Sindh, and the Asian Development Bank is also deeply engaged in the planning and complementation and professional advisory for Pakistan's free trade economic zones in the development phase or in the complementation phase. So the second impact is what we call that China is sharing its own economic development experience and expertise with Pakistan along with the Chinese investment. And the third impact is that with the implementation of CPEC, actually, it strengthened the Pakistan's political consensus and willingness for the economic development. And we know that the vision of China-Pakistan economic corridor was proposed in the middle of 2013 with China's Premier Li Keqiang, but it was implemented in the April of 2015 with Chinese President Xi Jinping's visit to Pakistan. And we know that in the very initial few months, especially in the late of 2015, there is very fierce debate in Pakistan about whether how to implement the CPEC, especially the debates on the west route and the east route. And at that time, many people think that this shows that the political lack of political consensus and also the domestic political fights in Pakistan would be one of the major risks or bottleneck for the CPEC. But we know that actually the process is dynamic. After the hot debate and the ruling government, especially the Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, found that it's not going to be the CPEC will not going to be successful without the more active engagement from the other parties, the opposition parties, and also from the local provinces, like from the Balochistan provinces, from the Sindh provinces, ruled by the PPP party. So there are many meetings and negotiations, and we can also see there are many compromises in the discussion of the implementation of CPEC. Actually, on the very ground, it relates to which project, which province, the project of which province should be included in the CPEC, and what will be the guidelines, and who will be responsible for it, especially in terms of who will provide the security forces to protect the CPEC, because we know that in terms of the security forces arrangements of CPEC, Pakistan government has two domains. One is from the federal level. There is unified military and police forces to secure and safeguard the CPEC projects and also the people. Actually, the federal government of Pakistan also convinced the local province from different parties that they could also provide security forces for the CPEC projects in their own provinces. By the time, if we look further, and by the time of December 2016, actually there is a stronger political consensus of CPEC in Pakistan, especially after the resolution of the east route or the west route. One of the landmark phenomenon is that there is a GCC meeting of CPEC in December, in the very late December. It's called the Joint Cooperation Conference. So actually, all the chief ministers of different provinces of Pakistan has attended this GCC meeting. They are on the same table and to discuss all the projects of CPEC. And the fourth impact is that the China's investment and CPEC really improve and enhance Pakistan's regional role and also the international image. We know that with China's investment in CPEC, there are also many international players are very interested in the CPEC, like UK, Japan, and South Korea. And also there are many regional partners from the Central Asia countries and also Iran. They are also propose their willingness to how to join the CPEC or how to benefit from it. The fifth impact is that we know there are many discussions about the social impact of China's investment, and with the CPEC, there is design of the social sectors in terms of the education, health, media, and also the party communication, and also the civil societies activities. Take the example of Gwadar, and with the Chinese investment, especially Chinese operation at Gwadar port, there is also school and hospitals with China's foreign aid or with China's social donation will be implemented in Gwadar. And the sixth is that actually Pakistan is really become a very popular destination of investment in China because I personally report about China's overseas investment, and we can see that in the 2017 that Pakistan has become the largest contracting market of Chinese contractors. This is a real thing, and for now there are many Chinese contractors. Previously they don't invest in the host country, but nowadays they are trying to transform and also invest in the host countries like in Pakistan. So I will stop here.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jennifer, and welcome all to USIP. You'd asked me to also speak about CPEC and China's sort of role in how it affects institutions in the countries it invests in, namely Pakistan. So I'll try and focus on that briefly, talking about the institutions, and then we can have a conversation around that. So I think the first point I want to make is to be clear that the CPEC initiative, to my mind, is a slightly different basket than the overall Belt and Road initiative. And the reason I say that is that I think this has almost become a compulsion for both China and Pakistan rather than a luxury. For China, because I think China has staked a lot on CPEC being the litmus test of Belt and Road success. The timeline is quicker than most others, and so what happens in CPEC will affect how the world looks at China's larger Belt and Road initiative. For Pakistan, interestingly, it's a compulsion because at the moment and for some time, Pakistan has seen and felt a need to find an anchor to get out of its perennial concern about India trying to isolate it. Whether that can happen or not is a different story, but Pakistan's worldview to a large extent flows from that. And so in Pakistan's case, it's really how do you get out of this problem of securitization of your budget, which keeps your economy at 3%, 4%, doesn't let it grow. So CPEC addresses its economic problem, potentially, by bringing in this investment. It anchors Pakistan with China in a way that, China becomes dependent on the success of this project. And by definition, then it also finds a way to diversify its alliance options, which have shrunk over the years considerably with a, jaundiced relationship with the US, tensions with India that continue, and a largely non-existent but now improving relationship with Russia. And so the reason I mention this is that I think both sides are going to keep at it and try to make this work despite the hurdles and hiccups that may come and definitely will come and have come already over time. That's important to understand. Second, because so much is staked on its success, I think you will have to assume that the Chinese are going to be more interventionist in trying to ensure the success of this initiative than they have been in Pakistan in the past. The China-Pakistan relationship so far has been a very interesting one. It's an entirely state-to-state relationship. It's a very deep, very strong, very significant relationship, both economic and security, but it's never involved anybody but the states, which means that the narratives of the two countries in each other's country have been fairly well managed and have been entirely positive for the most part. This is the first time I think China and Pakistan will have to operate beyond the state level. In terms of private sector, in terms of society, in terms of Chinese physical presence in Pakistan, in terms of Chinese citizens working in Pakistan, etc. So this is going to be a first test, I think, for China and Pakistan on how they operate when it comes to this kind of environment. And there, I think, a great example is the US-Pakistan relationship, where it's been a very interesting state plus society-led relationship for 70 years. And if you look at the popularity ratings of both countries in each other's capitals, you've got something left to be desired there. I'm not saying it'll end up that way, but I think it will be a challenge. Why would China need to be more involved? I think if you ultimately want a successful CPEC to prove that Belt and Road is going to be a success, and if this is the litmus test, the first thing you have to look at is that internal Pakistani political wrangling does not get to the point where it starts to sabotage the progress of CPEC. So you mentioned the east and west route, and I don't think we've heard the last of it. I think this is going to keep coming back because there's a lot of conversation still to happen between provinces on who owns what and where resources go, whether it's the economic zones, whether it's the infrastructure, etc. So I think that's one area where the China sort of approach to Pakistan and in general is to stay out of this, hands off. But at some point, if it gets too bad, I think the Chinese will have to play a role behind the scenes to make sure that it doesn't sabotage the progress. Second, I think if you have to ensure efficiency, there are a number of institutional issues that have to be worked out within the Pakistani bureaucratic system. It's a fairly, inertiatic system, if I will, and that doesn't really gel with the Chinese approach to development. So already I'm hearing that certain units set up in the Pakistani government, Chinese counterparts have had to come in and ask for changes in personnel, in terms of approach, in terms of how they operate, in terms of resources, the allocation of resources, because they feel that things are not moving as smoothly as they should. I think that will increase and perhaps create some tension as well on the Pakistani bureaucratic side. Third, this is a point that I'm plagiarizing from my colleague Andrew Wilder, who just spoke, but I'm shameless in that, so I'll take it. A point that he's made and I haven't heard anybody else make, which is that this is the first time Chinese citizens and Pakistani citizens are going to come in contact with each other. So questions about, sorry, don't look at me like that, I've taken it already, but questions about culture, questions about labor diversion, questions about rights wherever the Chinese are operating have never been answered before. And I think this is going to be a question that both sides will have to deal with fairly quickly and fairly decisively, because otherwise I do see problems there. I already hear conversations in Pakistan, people calling up somebody for a plumbing service and a Chinese company showing up to do that, which is all great. But I think if you start looking at a labor surplus country, which is going to start losing jobs, there will be some questions raised on that. Fourth, I think in terms of institutions, we will have to find out what the Chinese threshold for security risk is. We've already seen 2 Chinese nationals abducted and killed in Balochistan. What is the threshold? How far are we going to go? The U.S. threshold, as we know, is fairly low in these things in conflict environments. The Chinese have traditionally been higher, but how high will it be? I think we will have to wait and see. What does this mean for Pakistani institutions? And I'll stop at that. The first thing I would say is that you will see Pakistani institutions increasingly create special arrangements for CPEC. So you will see the normal bureaucratic channels being circumvented, special units being set up. They're already set up in some cases. The Prime Minister's office running some of this. This will be the highest priority in the coming months and years. So what you will find is that normal processes and rule of law systems, I think, will be circumvented in the name of greater efficiency. It will bring greater efficiency. But the long-term repercussions of that, we don't know, and we will have to wait and see. Second, I think you will also see special arrangements created for debt servicing and scheduling. And I think the Chinese will be more lenient on this than probably in other countries because of the litmus test factor that I've put out. We don't know yet what the debt burden is going to be. I think there's a lot made of this debt burden, rightly, but I also feel that this is a conversation that's very different in Beijing and Islamabad versus in Washington. The conversation in Washington on Chinese investments usually focuses on debt as trapping countries in this process. The conversation in Beijing and Islamabad and in other capitals is very much about delivery of infrastructure, energy, and economic progress. Where the middle is, we don't know yet, and I think this is a question that will be answered over time. Fourth, I think Pakistan's security institutions will also be compartmentalized to deal with CPEC. There's already a special force that's been created, or a division that's been created, but I think you will find more and more special units dealing with the problem of security for CPEC and the Chinese versus the rest. This is for the first time that such a major project is going to give the Pakistani Navy, that is really an orphan service when it comes to Pakistan military, a stake in the system. Because when it comes to Gwadar and the transshipment and the hub, it's really the Navy that's going to benefit from this. So I think that's going to create a very interesting dynamic within the Pakistani military as well. Let me just say, to conclude, two things. One, I think we are going to test with CPEC two rival global development models. One the Chinese, the other the American. The American model that focuses much more on institutions rather than resources, economic resources and infrastructure for long-term institutional development. And the Chinese model, which essentially says economic development equals stability. We will test this in Pakistan. We know that the US model has had problems in various contexts, but we also know that just throwing money at the problem has not worked for the most part. Again, I think the jury is out, and we will see where we end up. And my guess is the truth will be in the middle, as it always is. And finally, I think we're going to have a very interesting geostrategic dynamic to CPEC, which is India opposes CPEC. Every single time you see CPEC being targeted through terrorism, through anything else, Pakistan's default position will be to blame India. This will create more tensions between India and Pakistan because China is invested in CPEC and India has opposed Belt and Road. It will harden the Chinese-Pakistani alliance versus the Indian position on CPEC in South Asia. If you add to that the US-India relationship, I think what you will find in South Asia in the coming years is that CPEC will be one force. I'm not saying this will be the defining force. It will be one force that will probably harden the Sino-Pakistani alliance versus the US-India partnership. How that plays out in other broader spheres, Afghanistan and elsewhere, we'll have to wait and see. But I think you are going to move to that direction because of the force that CPEC brings to it.